There was a time intensity felt like connection, the pull, the unpredictability, the emotional highs that made everything feel alive. You didn't question it. You felt it and you followed it. Because intensity felt like chemistry. It felt like something real was happening, something meaningful, something worth exploring. And when it was there, it was hard to ignore, hard to walk away from, hard to see clearly. Because intensity does something powerful. It amplifies emotion. It speeds everything up. It makes moments feel bigger than they are, more significant, more consuming, more important. And for a while, that felt like depth, like passion, like connection. But over time, something started to change. Not all at once, not in a way you could easily explain, but enough to feel it. The same intensity that once pulled you in started to feel different, less exciting, less magnetic, less convincing. You began noticing what came with it: the inconsistency, the emotional swings, the unpredictability that once felt thrilling, but now felt draining. And slowly, something inside you started to recalibrate. You no longer felt drawn to what felt intense. You started noticing what felt steady instead, what felt calm, what felt clear, what didn't leave you questioning yourself after. And that shift can feel confusing at first because part of you wonders, where did that feeling go? Why doesn't this excite me the way it used to? Am I losing something? Or am I finally seeing clearly? Because when your attraction changes, it doesn't just affect who you choose, it changes how you experience connection entirely. And once that shift begins, you don't respond the same way anymore, even if you tried to. Intensity didn't pull you in by accident. It met something that already existed inside you: a sensitivity, a depth of feeling, a way of experiencing connection that wasn't surface level. So when something felt intense, it didn't feel chaotic at first. It felt alive, like something had finally reached you on the level you were already operating from. Because you weren't looking for something ordinary. You were looking for something that moved you, something that created a shift in your body, something that made you feel seen, chosen, significant. And intensity does that quickly. It creates closeness without time. It creates emotional weight without consistency. It creates the feeling of connection before a foundation has actually formed. And when you experience that, it's easy to believe, this must be real. This must mean something. This must be different. Because the feeling is so strong. It doesn't feel like something that could be random or temporary. But intensity isn't always depth. It's often acceleration. It speeds things up before they've had time to become stable. And when something moves quickly, your nervous system responds just as quickly. You become more alert, more focused, more emotionally invested, not because the connection is necessarily secure, but because it's activating. And activation can feel very similar to attraction. It creates anticipation. It creates urgency. It creates the sense that something important is happening right now. So you lean in. You give more attention. You invest more energy. You try to understand what you're feeling instead of questioning why it's happening so fast. And for a while, that pattern feels normal, even exciting, because you associate that emotional intensity with meaning, with significance, with connection. But over time, your body starts noticing what your mind is still trying to interpret: the inconsistency, the unpredictability, the way your emotions are constantly adjusting to what's happening in the moment. One day it feels strong, the next it feels uncertain. One moment you feel close, the next you feel distance. And that fluctuation keeps you engaged because you're not just experiencing connection. You're trying to stabilize it, trying to understand it, trying to hold on to it. And that effort can feel like investment, like care, like depth. But underneath it, there's something else, a constant state of emotional adjustment, where your sense of security is tied to what's happening next. And slowly, your body starts recognizing the cost of that, the tension, the overthinking, the way your energy is pulled into something that never quite settles. And once you start feeling that, intensity begins to change in meaning. It no longer feels like pure connection. It starts to feel like instability. And that's where the shift begins. Not because intensity disappears, but because your awareness of it deepens. You begin to see what it creates, not just how it feels, in the moment. And that awareness starts changing what you're drawn to. There comes a point where intensity stops feeling exciting and starts feeling expensive, not all at once, not in a way that shocks you, but gradually, quietly, in moments you wouldn't have noticed before. Moments where instead of feeling pulled in, you feel tired, where instead of feeling excited, you feel unsettled, where instead of leaning closer, something inside you pauses. And that pause is important because before, you didn't pause. You moved with it. You followed the feeling. You let the intensity carry you forward without questioning it. But now, your body hesitates. It doesn't fully trust what it once did. And that hesitation is your awareness catching up. Because over time, you didn't just experience the high of intensity, you experienced what came after it, the inconsistency that followed, the confusion that lingered, the emotional drop. After the peak, you started noticing how quickly things could shift, how something that felt so strong one day could feel uncertain the next, how reassurance would appear and then disappear, how effort would fluctuate instead of build. And without realizing it, your nervous system was tracking all of it. Every high, every drop, every moment. You had to read between the lines. Every moment, you had to interpret instead of simply receive. And that tracking changes how you feel over time because your body doesn't just remember the excitement, it remembers the instability. It remembers what it cost you to stay in that dynamic, the overthinking, the waiting, the questioning, the subtle anxiety of not knowing what comes next. And eventually, that cost becomes too clear to ignore. You start feeling it in real time, not after the fact, not once you're already invested, but in the moment. It's happening. Someone comes in strong, too quickly, and instead of feeling flattered, you feel cautious. Instead of feeling excited, you feel observant. Instead of leaning in, you slow down. That's new. Before, that kind of attention would have pulled you in. You would have matched it. You would have engaged with it. You would have interpreted it as interest, as effort, as connection. But now, you're not just looking at what's being given. You're looking at how it's being given, the pace, the consistency, the stability behind it. And when something feels too intense too quickly, it doesn't feel like depth anymore. It feels like acceleration, without grounding, like something that hasn't had time to become real. And your body recognizes that. It doesn't attach the same way. It doesn't get pulled into the same emotional rhythm because it's learned what that rhythm leads to. And that's where the recalibration happens, not in your thoughts first, but in your response. You stop reacting to intensity the way you used to. You stop interpreting it as something inherently meaningful. You stop assigning depth to something that hasn't proven consistency. And that changes everything because intensity relies on your reaction. It relies on you meeting it, matching it, feeding into it. But when you don't, it loses its hold. It no longer feels as powerful, as convincing, as magnetic. And instead, you start noticing what feels different. The connections that don't rush, the conversations that don't spike and drop, the presence that feels steady instead of fluctuating. At first, that can feel unfamiliar, almost underwhelming, because your system was used to intensity, used to the rise and fall, used to the emotional peaks that made things feel alive. So when something feels calm, it doesn't immediately register as attraction. It feels neutral, slower, less consuming. And part of you might question that. You might think, why doesn't this feel as strong? Why isn't this as exciting? Where's that spark? But what you're actually experiencing is the absence of instability, the absence of emotional spikes, the absence of having to figure something out in real time. And because you're not being activated, your body isn't reacting the same way. It's not pulling you into urgency. It's not creating that sense of immediate attachment. It's allowing space for something to build instead of spike. And that kind of space can feel unfamiliar if you've been used to intensity because it requires a different kind of attention, a slower kind, a more grounded kind, where you're not chasing a feeling, but observing what's actually there. And that's where discernment begins. You start noticing what is consistent without being announced, what is present without being dramatic, what is stable without needing to prove itself through intensity. And slowly, your attraction begins to follow that instead, not because you forced it, but because your body feels safer there, more at ease, more settled. You don't leave those interactions questioning everything. You don't replay every moment, trying to understand what it meant. You don't feel that same emotional pull to analyze or interpret. You just experience it. And that experience feels different, quieter, but clearer, less consuming, but more real. And over time, that clarity becomes more attractive than intensity ever was, because it doesn't cost you your peace. It doesn't require you to constantly adjust your emotions to keep up with it. It doesn't pull you into cycles that leave you feeling drained after. It stays steady, predictable, in a healthy way, grounded. And once your system experiences that, really experiences it, intensity starts losing its appeal completely, not because you're avoiding it, but because it no longer aligns with what you need. You've felt the difference now between what is activating and what is stabilizing, between what feels intense and what feels secure. And that difference can't be unseen. You can't go back to interpreting intensity the same way because your awareness has shifted, your standards have shifted, your nervous system has shifted, and with that shift, your attraction naturally follows. There comes a moment where you stop chasing what feels intense and start choosing what feels safe. Not safe in a boring way, not safe in a way that lacks feeling, but safe in a way that allows you to stay connected to yourself. Because that's the real shift. You're no longer choosing based on how strongly something pulls you. You're choosing based on how stable you feel within it. And that difference is everything. Before, intensity took you out of yourself. It pulled your focus outward, toward the other person, toward the dynamic, toward trying to understand. What was happening in real time? You felt it in your body. The anticipation, the emotional spikes, the sense that something important was unfolding. But at the same time, you were adjusting, reading between the lines, trying to make sense of inconsistency, trying to stabilize something that never quite settled. And that effort felt like involvement, like care, like connection. But now, you see it differently. You see how much of you was being used just to maintain that feeling. How much of your energy went into interpreting instead of experiencing, analyzing instead of receiving, holding on instead of feeling secure. And once you see that, you can't ignore it because your awareness doesn't just change what you think, it changes what you tolerate. And that's where your choices begin to shift. You start noticing how you feel during connection, not just after it. Do you feel grounded? Or do you feel slightly unsettled? Do you feel calm? Or do you feel like you're trying to keep up? Do you feel present? Or do you feel pulled into anticipation? These questions become more important than the intensity itself because you're no longer measuring connection by how strong it feels, but by how steady it remains. And that's where something powerful happens. You stop chasing the emotional high, not because you're avoiding it, but because you recognize what comes with it. You recognize the instability, the inconsistency, the emotional cost that follows the peak. And instead, you begin to value something different: consistency, presence, emotional availability. That doesn't fluctuate. At first, this can feel unfamiliar because it doesn't create that immediate spark. It doesn't pull you in the same way. It doesn't overwhelm your senses. It builds slowly, steadily, over time. And that kind of connection requires patience. It requires trust in the process. It requires letting something develop instead of trying to feel it instantly. And that's where many people get stuck. Because when you're used to intensity, calm can feel like a lack of chemistry. You might question it. You might doubt it. You might think something is missing. But what's actually missing is the activation, the emotional spike that used to signal something important. And once you understand that, you begin to see calm differently, not as absence, but as stability, not as lack, but as clarity. Because in calm, you can see things clearly. You can observe patterns without distortion. You can feel your own responses without being overwhelmed. You can stay connected to yourself while connecting with someone else. And that is what real depth actually looks like. Not intensity that consumes you, but presence that includes you. You're not losing yourself in the connection. You're bringing yourself into it fully, clearly, without needing to adjust or chase or interpret. And that changes how attraction feels. It becomes quieter, but stronger, less reactive, but more intentional. You're not pulled in by force. You're choosing based on alignment, based on how something holds up over time, based on how it feels to stay in it, not just enter it. And once you experience that kind of connection, your standards shift again. You realize you don't need intensity to feel something real. You don't need unpredictability to feel excitement. You don't need emotional highs to feel depth, because depth isn't created in spikes. It's created in consistency, in presence, in the steady unfolding of something that doesn't rush and doesn't disappear. And once you feel that, really feel it, intensity no longer has the same appeal. It feels familiar, but not aligned, recognizable, but not desirable, because you've experienced something different now, something that doesn't take you out of yourself, to feel connected, something that allows you to stay grounded while still feeling deeply. And that's the difference. You're not becoming less emotional. You're becoming more regulated, more aware, more intentional with what you allow to move you. And because of that, your attraction naturally follows. What feels stable? What feels consistent? What feels real over time? Not just in the moment. You didn't lose your ability to feel deeply. You refined it. For a long time, you believed that intensity was proof of connection. If it felt strong, it must mean something. If it pulled you in, it must be real. If it consumed your attention, it must be worth it. But now, you understand something you didn't see before. Intensity doesn't always mean there's depth. Sometimes, it just means something is activating you. Something is triggering a response that feels powerful, but isn't necessarily stable. And once you see that clearly, you stop confusing emotional reaction with emotional connection. That distinction changes everything because now you're not asking, how strong does this feel? You're asking, how steady is this over time? How do I feel when I'm in it? Do I feel grounded? Or do I feel pulled? Do I feel clear? Or do I feel confused? Those questions replace the old measure of attraction. And with that, your entire experience of connection changes. You no longer chase the feeling that once consumed you. You observe it. You recognize it. But you don't follow it blindly because you've learned what it leads to. The inconsistency, the emotional highs that don't sustain, the confusion that follows intensity without foundation, and you're no longer willing to trade your peace for that experience, not even for a moment, because your peace now holds more value than the temporary rush of intensity. That's the shift. You're not becoming less passionate. You're becoming more discerning. You're not losing your depth. You're protecting it. You're no longer allowing just anything to access it simply because it feels strong in the moment. You're choosing what earns that access through consistency, through presence, through emotional stability. That doesn't fluctuate based on mood or moment. And that choice is what changes your attraction permanently. Because now you're drawn to what feels safe without feeling dull, what feels calm without feeling empty, what feels consistent without needing to prove itself through intensity. And once your system adjusts to that fully, intensity no longer feels like something you're missing. It feels like something you've outgrown, not in a judgmental way, not in a dismissive way, but in an aware way. You recognize it, but you don't need it because you've experienced what real connection feels like when it's built instead of rushed, when it's steady instead of unpredictable, when it includes you instead of overwhelming you. And that experience redefines everything. You stop questioning, why don't I feel the same spark, and start understanding this feels different because it's healthier, because it's not activating old patterns, it's aligning with who you are now. And that alignment is what makes it last. Not intensity, not urgency, not emotional spikes, but consistency over time. That's what holds. That's what builds. That's what creates something real. And once you trust that fully, you stop looking back at intensity as something you lost. You see it for what it was, a phase, a pattern, a level of awareness. You've moved beyond, and you step forward with a different kind of attraction, one that chooses peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, stability over intensity, and truth over temporary feeling. If this resonated with you, then you're already in that shift, the one where your attraction is no longer driven by what feels intense, but guided by what feels real, safe, and consistent. Stay with us, at depth of us, because this space is for women who are no longer chasing emotional highs, but building connections that feel grounded, clear, and lasting.